have you considered that the psychology of humanity that directly impacts the actions of individuals and populations are a key feature in the outcome of how climate change impacts play out?
I find that a difficult question. What it immediately brings to mind is the notion of the Anthropocene.
Yes.
That we're now entering an era in which the imprint of humanity on our planet, it's a systemic force. And I'd like to say here, and I think it's relevant to your question, that I'd like to acknowledge a preceding discipline that was around for some years before, some decades before the notion of climate psychology got coined. That is the field of eco-psychology. And there are a number of really interesting and big ideas in that, but one of them is that in our era it no longer is feasible to think about and talk about ecology without bringing in the question of human functioning and human impacts. And equally, there isn't really the possibility of a complete psychology without taking into account the planetary ecological perspective. There needs to be an integration of the two. So I don't know to what extent that addresses your question, but that's certainly what comes to my mind. And I do want to just say, at the risk of over-hammering this point, that climate, as well as being a huge issue in its own right, is also a shorthand for a range of issues. I think Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Centre has identified a whole number of what they call planetary boundaries, and collapse of biodiversity is actually identified as the most serious of those issues. And then we have the nitrogen cycle, which is also I think past a critical threshold, and then climate following up with other problems such as ocean acidification some way behind. But of course, these things all interconnect.
Yeah.
So climate is both a very significant issue in its own right, and also a shorthand for a multi-dimensional transformation, and I think one has to say destructive influence that the activities of humanity are having on our planetary systems.
From the CPA's standpoint, what's the method for somehow trying to navigate?
Well, when you use that term navigate, my immediate thought is that we're having to bear in mind adaptation and mitigation in parallel all the time. I think Lord Stern said something about that we have to adapt to what we can't mitigate. And we must mitigate what we can't adapt to. And this takes us into another really difficult area, which you alluded to a few minutes ago, which is what are we on course for? Although climate science is very solid about where we're going, we still have uncertainties about the exact value of climate sensitivity, in response to a doubling of CO2 levels, and we still have a lot of uncertainty about where tipping points are located. So I think this is a real challenge and a real problem. We're having to bear in mind all the time an ambiguity, a profound ambiguity in our frame of reference, in that we don't know what it is that we're preparing for. We have some pretty sobering ideas of what's in store if we don't take radical action, but and it comes back to radical hope as well in a way. We don't have the luxury of knowing whether our task as climate psychologists is to try to help prepare humanity, if that doesn't sound too grandiose, for a process of really widespread devastation on a far greater scale than is already apparent, and heaven knows that is serious enough. Or whether our prime emphasis continues to be on mitigation and bending every effort to alleviate the worst of the climate impacts as a result of what has already happened. And of course, you touched on the question of negative emissions, and that is highly relevant because, as Kevin Anderson pointed out so uncompromisingly at Paris, we are to some extent making ourselves hostage to technologies that are unproven in order to make our projections of a sub-catastrophic levelling off look feasible.
I want to go back to this idea of adaptation and mitigation, because if we're not really accepting or taking it very seriously, then we're not going to be that interested in building any resilience. That seems to be the issue.
And it is a systemic issue. Ro Randall and Paul Hoggett in their research with climate scientists uncovered they took George Marshall's idea of a socially constructed silence and applied it to what they unearthed in their conversations with climate scientists about an increasing reticence with regard to public communication, an increasing wariness and caution following ClimateGate and Copenhagen. But they saw it as going much deeper, in the sense that what Hoggett and Randall, the disturbing conclusion that they reached as a result of these conversations with climate scientists was that the silence that largely prevails within the scientific community about the cognitive dissonance, the science policy disconnect, that we're talking about 2 degrees or even closer to 1.5 degrees, and yet existing policy and commitments are not only generally recognised as keeping us on course for 3 or 4 degrees, but there are significant dissenting voices saying no, actually we're talking about something more like 6 degrees here, which is the end of civilization as we know it. And the disturbing point that emerged from that research work was that the reticence from within climate science, the sort of retreating back into the bunker of, we're doing our work and we're coming up with the information, it's up to other people as to what they do with it and what they do about it. That reticence was not deliberately but effectively colluding with the tendency at the level of political leadership to take symbolic rather than real action, as I mentioned earlier, to be saying all the right things and making gestures and doing perhaps to a degree real things, but not really grasping the nettles when it comes to extraction of fossil fuels and the current levels of consumption in the rich world. So, a very disturbing conclusion that.
The need for a massive reduction in consumption in developed world. And I think that's going to be a very difficult sell.
A very difficult sell, and it comes back to that notion of a nexus of denial. You have a timid political leadership which knows full well that the climate message spelt out fully and starkly and truthfully is not going to be welcome. A populace who has probably a complex response but is to a large extent happy to go along with symbolic actions.
Yeah.
I don't want to presume that the majority of people are kidded by that, but I don't see a lot of evidence that the majority of people see through that with determination. And media that are playing very much into that game for reasons we've already touched on.